going to continue with dissertation writing, specifically chapter 3. Chapter 3, I will say, is the backbone of the dissertation because it encompasses everything talking about your research instruments. So, chapter 3 normally is the backbone of your research, and it is regarded or labeled as methodology of the study. Methodology of the study. That is how it is labeled. Methodology of the study. That tells you the methods you are using as a researcher to conduct or to carry out the research. Now, normally, some people may use personal pronouns when writing their chapter 3. Some people normally use personal pronouns when they are writing their chapter 3. First person singular, they can use that one sometimes. They will say, I. Using that word always I used to tell my students, I made an attempt to administer a questionnaire to the respective respondent. You should not use that word I. You will say instead, the researcher makes use of questionnaires that were administered to the respective respondent. So normally some will use I, even with also postgraduate students. That is an error on their own part. So don't ever use the word I. Say researcher. That is one error I have identified. Now the methodology of the study tells you about the methods that the researcher may adopt to carry out the research or to conduct his research, which has to take into consideration or into cognizance certain variables that I have to break them or identify them explicitly so that we understand. There are certain variables, if you don't understand them, when you are writing your chapter 3, you will find it difficult. Those variables should be identified. For example, if you are talking about research instrument, but before that, always in your chapter 3, you must have to introduce, as the case may be in chapter 2. You must have to write 3.0 or 3.1. Chapter 3 presents the methodology of the study that is adopted by the researcher to carry on the research. The following variables or research instruments are to be considered below. Research design. Only right. Research design. You look at data collection, data analysis. Those are variables you must have to consider when you are writing them, when you are identifying or you are adopting a methodology approach. It is so methodological. So that is why you have to be so systematic and chronological in your analysis or in presenting your chapter 3. Take cognizance of the research instrument. Chapter 3 presents the general methodology of the study, which takes cognizance of the research instrument or the variables. Research design, if you can talk about that. Data collection, data analysis, as the case may be. Now, research design tells you about the area that is conducted. You as a researcher, you are being targeted or you are being asked to explore. That's your research design. The area you are doing your research, taking account of the population. That's your research design. You have to go to your data collection. Data collection, here now you have to identify, apart from your data analysis, your data design, you have to, at that particular stage, bring about what we call, you identify the type of research you are saying, or you have to what? Conduct. For instance, you can say, this research is purely qualitative or what? Quantitative. You give a short description. Or if you are using triangulation, which is both qualitative or quantitative research, especially with social sciences and law, you have to identify that one as well. This research is purely descriptive, taking cognizance of qualitative and quantitative approaches. Qualitatively, it tells you about what? You talk on it. Quantitatively, it will be used to quantify what? Tables, frequencies, pie charts, and other things. So you have straight away identified the method you are going to use. Your description. Your data collection tells you about the tools, or what we call the research instrument or tools you are going to use. There comes the administering of questionnaire. But I said questionnaire is not compulsory in all research. Now, under the data collection, you may talk about administering of questionnaire for social sciences and law. That is the part of quantitative research. You are administering questionnaire to the respective respondents in the society, taking cognizance of the stated objectives. So how are you going to administer questionnaires? That should be stated. You also have to look about what we call other methods or other research instruments. For example, you may talk about what we call an in-depth interview. An in-depth interview. You have to interview some respondents to give you relevant information with respect to the topic. In your chapter 3, don't forget, very important, identify what you call sample of the population. It depends on your research. It depends on your demography, or the research design, or the population you have already identified in the society. For example, if you are talking about prostitution in the western part of Freetown, a sample of that particular population, if for example in the western area you have about 5,000 or 7,000 people living in that particular western area, you can do a sample design. You identify just some collection of those people. For example, you can say sample design is about what? 60 respondents. 60 respondents, you identify the ranges. You can take, for example, 15 to 20 is 15 respondents. 20 to 20 what? To 40, another set. 40 and above. So if you are taking realistically 70 respondents or 80 respondents, or as the case may be, you have to also range them. The age categories, they are very important, because when you are administering your questionnaires, you have to identify a specific set or age of a particular society in which they live. Or if you are talking about prostitution, perhaps in the western area, you can administer, if you want to make it simple, 60, administer, for example, 40 respondents to what? To young ladies living in that particular society. The remaining was 30, you administer what? To male in that particular society. Because we know that prostitution is normally, the percentage of it is more from what? Women. So you can make it 40 to young ladies, 30 to young men. You can get your data from there. So identification of a sample design depends on the population. If you have about, for example, about 5,000, you can identify about 70 respondents. And the respective people you have selected in that particular society, they are what we call representation of their respective what? Areas. You cannot get or interview all of them. 5,000 people, that is a burden on the researcher. So that is why you have to do sample selection. Just take sample of the population, 70, 80, 100, 120 as the case may be. So you have got a sample that you believe you have interviewed them, that you believe you have administered questionnaires on them, and that you believe they will give you coherent or relevant information with respect to the topic. So that is the essence or the efficacy of sample selection. You may have an in-depth interview with respondents. It could be direct. You go to them, the respondent, you interview them. That is why you should have your paper and your pen. When you are interviewing them, you write them. You write those questions and answer. You interview them. That is an in-depth interview. You may have what you call group discussion. That is another research instrument. Group discussion. Having dialogue with the respondent. If the language, yes, you have language barrier there, now you can bring an interpreter to interpret exactly what you are saying. But always what we call ethical consideration is very important in research. That is why some students normally bring it. Because the group discussions, the interview, questionnaires, all of them have to be confidential. So ethical consideration is very important in chapter 3. I normally accept that one as the last point under chapter 3, ethical consideration. Because of confidentiality, whatsoever thing you are going to discuss with the respondent should be kept secret, should not be exposed because of confidentiality, especially with respect to administering of questionnaires. That is why, if especially the topic is so sensitive or so dynamic, sensitive or very technical, some respondents are always reluctant to give answers. Even also for them to receive a questionnaire from them, to give them, to receive questionnaire from you, they will not do it because of the sensitivity of the topic. It will either implicate them, or you have to implicate them, or they themselves also will implicate them, themselves there. So that is why confidentiality as an ethical consideration is very important. That is the aspect of ethics we are talking about. Now, your chapter 3, as I said, it should be chronologically detailed. Research design, design of the area. You talk about what? An in-depth interview. You talk about group discussion. You talk about what? Dissertation instrument, which is one of the questionnaires. You talk about sample selection. You can arrange them as you are advised by your supervisor. Some people will start with research design. Some will start with an in-depth interview. Some will start with group discussion. So that one depends according to your supervisor. Some will start with even also administering of questionnaire. Some also have what you call alternatives. They can divide that one into two. They have what you call primary source and secondary source. Then what is the meaning of primary source? Or primary data and secondary data? Primary data or primary source. When you talk about primary, it is the most important source in a dissertation. So primary data or primary source is the most relevant raw material in a research. And primary data or primary research entails what? Your research instrument that as a researcher you have adopted to do your research. That takes cognizance of certain variables. For example, your primary source, in-depth interview is one. Your primary source, research design is another one. Your primary source, group discussions or what you call dialogue is another one. Your primary source, administering of what? Questionnaire is another one. Those are all raw materials, which is direct. You have used as variables to get a source of information from the respective respondent. So all those variables should be classified under primary source. And that one should come first. You have what you call now secondary data. That follows is primary data. Secondary means Another source of information besides raw materials, besides in-depth interview, besides administering of questionnaires, besides group discussion, besides in-depth interview, besides dialogue, etc., etc. What are other sources? The secondary sources of data. The secondary sources of data take cognizance of what? Textbooks. If that one is a legal textbook, say legal textbooks. So it take cognizance of what? Textbooks. Take cognizance of what? All dissertations you consulted. Take cognizance of what? Documentary reports. Take cognizance of what? Articles. Take cognizance of what? Reports being reported, being published or not published. Take cognizance of what? Articles being published or not published. So those are all classified under secondary data. So it depends the way your supervisor may direct you. Precisely, that is exactly what chapter 3 entails. So you are not going to use so many pages. For example, writing 10, 11 pages, 12 pages to write your chapter 3. It is one of the shortest chapters. But the shortest among them all is chapter 5, which shall be dealt with later. But chapter 3 precisely is one of the shortest chapters. You have one of the shortest chapters you have to write. You have to so be precise, chronological, and detailed in your analysis. Normally, as a supervisor and a lecturer, I normally treat chapter 3 with that of what you call administering of questionnaire. Because normally, when you are submitting your chapter 3, you should submit it along with a questionnaire that you are prepared as what? As a student. You must have to prepare a questionnaire. So when you are taking your chapter 3 to me, make sure you have got or you are prepared your questionnaire. If you are doing triangulations, if you are doing what you call quantitative research, you must have prepared what? A questionnaire for me. Because you are going to administer a questionnaire. Now I want to tell you about the efficacy of questionnaires. So the students have problem with always questionnaire, how to administer questionnaire. You have to prepare it first before the questionnaire is administered. That is a serious challenge or problem, even postgraduate students. You see, that is always a complaint. How could I go about my questionnaire? How to prepare it? It's very simple and precise. I will tell you also about the efficacy of preparing a questionnaire. Now, all what questionnaire is about, which is one of the research instruments, is to elicit information from the respective respondents, to obtain information from those respondents using a method that we call a questionnaire. So if you are eliciting information from the respective respondent, you have to prepare a questionnaire. How do you go about it? In the first place, normally you can get letter from your department or from the dean of faculty. It could be your head of department, for example, if you are social work, sociology. You can go there, your head of department will prepare what? A letter authorizing you to undertake or to administer a questionnaire. That letter is very important and it has to be attached later to that of your final dissertation at the back. Because that letter mandates you as a student, or it permits you to enter into any office, or as the case may be, where you are conducting a research, for you to be allowed by those authorities to conduct a research. So the first thing you should do, get a letter, draft of a letter from your head of department or from the faculty of day. But normally it is more good you get it from your head of department. Sometimes in the absence of what? Absence of your head of department, Your supervisor can even draft the letter and take it to the head of department to endorse it by appending his signature and also a stamp on it, authorizing you now to go to any office of your choice or where necessarily you are conducting the research, so that when you go to the office, they will permit you. Because the first thing, if you want to administer a questionnaire in a particular organization office, they say, where is your letter and where is your identification? So that letter identifies you as a student of that institution and permits you also to enter into dialogue or conversation with the respective respondents. So that is the first stage. And the efficacy of that one, it should be seen that it's going to be attached later at the back of the dissertation to tell the supervisor that you are authorized. That's the first step. Now we go to how to prepare a dissertation. How to prepare a questionnaire. In the first place, you have received that letter. Secondly, you have now to have your A4 papers. You write or type the topic exactly. Your topic should be written. Your name, university, etc., etc., etc. Then your topic. Then you write it, Administering of Questionnaire, to the respective respondents in Kabbalah, in Kenema, in the western part of Freetown, in Bo, in Southern District, in Eastern District, in Northern District, as the case may be. You identify it, your topic. Now, on that same paper, your questionnaire should be divided into what we call into sections. You may have section A, you may have section B, you may have section C, you may have section D, you may have section E, you may have section F, as the case may be. As long as your objectives were clearly written in chapter 1.3, 5 objectives, and you dealt with them adequately also in chapter 2 with respect to the views of scholars, you are again to bring those objectives in your questionnaire. For example, section A, some people will say demographic information of the respective of what? The respective respondents. Some in the first place in section 1, though it has not been identified as one of the objectives, or it has not been identified as objective 1, they will write it demographic information of the respondent living in Kalbatown. Here they will talk about the name of the respondent, married name dash, marital status is married or what, or married dash, educational status dash, religion dash. Some usually use section A to identify historical background of that respondent, especially his family background, taking cognizance of the respondent's name. Of course, you are not going to write his name. Taking cognizance of the ethnic group that particular respondent belongs, marital status, religion, etc., etc. Some usually use that one as far as they are concerned for section A, that you have to supply the necessary details or information with respect to that section. I am not disputing that fact. But what is prominent is this. If you are doing that demographic information on the respective respondent living in that particular society, you must have identified that one as one of your objectives or objective 1. so that you can just flow from there. But however, there is still room provided for that, irrespective of the fact it is not stated in your objective. But you may want to have an insight information or detailed analysis of the respondent with respect to his or her background. So that one, normally they take it as objective or a part of section A. If that is so, then you go to section B. Now, in section B now, you have to identify the first objective. For example, to identify the causes of prostitution in the western part of Britain. You are not going to write it again to identify the causes of what? Prostitution in the western part of Britain. In your section B now, you caption it this way: causes of prostitution in the western part of Britain. That should be your caption. Now you are going to develop so many questions with respect to that particular caption. How? You are not writing what we call open-ended questions. You are bringing what we call narrow question. You narrow your question. If you are talking about causes of prostitution in the western part of what? Britain, do not give open-ended questions to the respondent by saying, what are the causes of prostitution in the western part of Britain? The respondent will give you 9 pages. You have to formulate a question, narrow it, so that if ever the respondent is answering that question, he will not give you more than 2 sentences. He will give you 1 sentence. You are limiting the scope and writing of that particular respondent. Or else, if you ask continuously open-ended questions, even the space you have provided will not be enough. What are the causes of prostitution in the western part of Britain? He will give you 10 pages. The space even provided will not be enough. But if you limit him by narrowing the question, for example, which part of the area is prostitution very prominent in your locality? He will say, at Brufis Hotel. How many young ladies do you normally see them engage in prostitution? He will show you. You are limiting. How often do they appear? You can put sometime the options, night, afternoon, blah, blah. So you see, you are narrowing what? The questions to elicit information from the respondent. So that causes of prostitution bring about narrow-ended questions. Narrow questions that you will elicit information from the respective respondent rather than giving me open-ended questions. What are the causes? What are the problems? No. That is for objective 1, causes. Now, that is for section B. Then you go to section C. You take the second one, objective. For example, what are the appalling, to identify the appalling effects of what? Prostitution in the western part of Sierra Leone. Let's say that is your what? Your third objective. You are not going to write it to identify the appalling effect. Just state it, the appalling effect of prostitution in the western part or in the Brufis area. You can also ask what? Narrow questions. How do you think this prostitution will affect the society? Or by asking a question like this, posing a question like this. Prostitution, does it affect your occupation? That is a question. You see, narrow it. Do normally prostitutes have psychological implications? How often? You are asking those narrow questions so that they will elicit information. That should be section what? C. Section D. If you are talking about challenges, to identify the challenges faced by these people engaged into prostitution. What are the challenges to identify? So you can say challenges faced by prostitutes or those who engage in prostitution. What are the challenges? Bring about what? Narrow questions. But there are certain areas you can bring open-ended questions. Section D, from there you go to E, which might also be the fourth objective. Then you can go to F, which might also be the recommendations. Now, in dealing with the recommendations, you can bring about open-ended questions. What are the main appropriate remedies in minimizing prostitution in the Bufis area? What are the main remedies or solutions in minimizing prostitution in the western part of Freetown or in Brookfield area? There now, you can bring about open-ended questions that the respondent will answer using one or two sentences. That is for section F. So when you have gone through all those sections, you have prepared a well masterpiece questionnaire to be administered to the respondent. Now the case might also be that in certain dissertations, you may have subgroups. For example, if you are administering now a questionnaire to school authorities, you must have to divide the questionnaire into groups. One set will be for the school administrators, another set will be for the PPs, another set will be also for the parents. So questionnaire preparing it depends on the topic and your research topics, your research objectives. So the research objectives that you have identified in where? In your chapter 1 and clearly dealt with in chapter 2 is what you are going to re-echo in your what? Questionnaire, in preparing your questionnaire. Any one objective is for one section. Any one objective is for one section until you have dealt with all the 5 objectives. Now, what is all about the efficacy of this questionnaire? It's not only to elicit information from the respondent or data from the respondent, but it is also the work. Because at the end of the day, you are going to those respondents to collect the data or the questionnaire you have administered. You can administer about 100 questionnaire. It's not certain that you can also what? Collect 100, as the case may be. You may administer 100 and get 70 or 60. But what is important, those questionnaires you have what? Administer is what you are going to apply in your chapter 4. So that is the efficacy of administering of questionnaire. Because the questionnaire is going to be analyzed and be adopted now in chapter 4 with respect still with your stated objectives. You see, so the stated objectives you have administered in the form of questionnaire is what you have to bring in your chapter 4. So the efficacy of administering questionnaire is for you to be guided when you are writing your chapter 4. So that is why I will always say it, that your chapter 3 should go along with what? Preparing a questionnaire. I thank you everybody for listening, and I expect comments, critique, and other things from you. Once more, I am Esau Kamara, lecturer, University, Probe College, University of Sierra Leone, BA Education, LLB Honors, Masters in Education, MSc in Sociology, and a PhD candidate. I thank you all for listening. I will continue with chapters 4 and 5 next week. God bless you all.